Uh-oh.
Hey, it says live. That's good.
Well,
It's a good sign.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe it's working, maybe it's not. I hope it does. I was about to say it's good to be back because I wasn't there the last time. But hey, Catherine, hey, Chris, how are you all doing?
It's good to
Hey,
see
we're
you
good.
again. It's been a minute.
Yeah. I think it's just the one. Okay, I think we're live except on uh LinkedIn for whatever reason. So
We're
okay.
linked out.
Yeah, we're linked out basically.
Ouch.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's the beauty of live, right? Anyway, well, today I'm very excited to invite with us Allison. Allison Shaw. Hi.
Hello.
I'm gonna put you out. Allison, how are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Yeah.
Cloudy day out in San Francisco right now, at least where I am.
Okay. Okay. And for the audience that might or might not know Allison, Allison is the new director of Spectrum, and Spectrum is the design system at Adobe.
Yes.
We're super excited to hear about this whole thing. And yeah, usually, Allison, we start with talking about kind of like interesting things that happened between the last time we had this, like this little talk and today. And maybe the first thing that we can talk about is if you're with us, that means that you're not into design system, unfortunately. Who has the ticket here? No? Okay.
People on our team do.
Yeah, I do have a ticket. Obviously, I am not there, and but I hope I will get the recordings later. But yeah, I think it's cool to have design system conferences in the more the merrier, I think. So this is cool.
I mean, this group does such a good job of getting a diverse set of voices out there. I think that like one of the really exciting parts about it is you see lots of people that have something interesting to say in the world of design systems, but aren't people that are part of like every single conference circuit ever. And so I love conferences like that. When I used to work in the Drupal community, one of my favorite things was trying to make sure that I went to all the sessions that had been presented by people that had never spoken before. And I think it's great to see this sort of stuff happening.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Looking at the lineup, but yeah, it is interesting. And also it's like, this is obviously, I mean, as an expat, but I'm French, and I can remember when I was in France and like so many cool things would happen, and they were kind of like out of reach because they were all in San Francisco or New York.
Hey,
And
there's
so,
the newest Adobe team member that I'm aware of right there.
Yeah, Nate Baldwin.
yeah, he's
just
here.
came back. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they design systems at Adobe. They got it right.
Yes. Yesterday I was like, "Hey man, do you want to update that?"
Yeah, but anyway, I appreciate, as a former left out European, to see that there's things happening in that part of the world too. So yeah, that's cool. I think, Chris, you wanted also to talk about a little bit about the Global Accessibility Awareness Day.
Yeah, I mean, wow, they even have a counter on there. I mean, look, it's Global Accessibility Awareness Day tomorrow, and so Knapsack has a pretty strong commitment to accessibility. It's obviously something that's important to our industry. It's something that really matters, and I think that in particular, the alignment to design systems here is super important. I think that design systems are a major enabler of accessible experiences, and I think that there's this whole new avenue of accessibility that's going to start to open up as people get more and more foundational acceptance of design systems in their organization. We also had a great podcast about this recently with Daniel, and so I think that there's just a lot in this conversation that is still not at the forefront of design systems, but is significantly influenced by their adoption. And so If you're in the design system space, in the web development community, take a moment to look at this, because I think it is really important. And it's still one of those things that, like, while we talk about it a fair amount in industry, this is an opportunity to actually take action about it.
Yeah. Accessibility was a huge part of the practice for design systems at my previous company, and it's also an important part of the one at Adobe. But I've done a bunch of speaking on accessibility and design systems in the past, and I think it's really just like they just go together so well. And design systems are such a powerful vehicle for accessibility. So I love seeing this stuff. I like that there's more awareness of Global Accessibility Awareness Day now. It's cool to see it kind of taking shape.
Yeah, I can definitely vouch about Allison doing a lot of talks around accessibility, because, fun fact, Allison was actually the very first guest when I started my meetup years ago, in a world that seems totally different now, like, meetups. But yeah, like, she was the very first guest to the meetup that I was doing called The Interface back in the days of, in Silicon Valley. So yeah, Allison's been a big accessibility advocate. So yeah. The other thing that I think is, to your point, I think, Allison, is that for me, like, accessibility in design system is at the same time, well, it's three things, I think. One is it's a great selling point for teams to adopt, because, and this is actually my second point, I think accessibility is a great use case where, like, to me, like, part of a design system is actually to augment everybody's capabilities. And so whether or not you know much about accessibility, through the design system, we get you there. And that's, I think, what is an important part of it. But yeah, this is great. And yeah, hopefully, I don't know. Do you know what the day is about, Chris? Is there
so it's about awareness. And so we made some posts about it and stuff like that, not to sit there and tout our LinkedIn or anything like that, but the idea of, like, getting people talking about this, getting people to think about it. And I think that one of the cool things about it is, like, there's a bunch of events and ways to participate that are all across the top nav of that site over there. One of the great ways to think about it is, making some sort of commitment to have an accessible product, have an accessible experience, and to really equate good design with design that is accessible. And so I think that that's a lot of what the mission of this organization is to basically say, like, look, accessibility is an important consideration, but thinking that accessibility is somehow separate from good design is not really the right kind of conversation. Good design is accessible by its very nature. And I think that design systems have this unique position to be able to spread good, accessible design in a way that I think is kind of unique. So, I mean, I have no affiliation to Global Accessibility Awareness Day, other than I definitely support it. And so it's worth definitely checking out the site and talk about it. Get a post up there. Start a conversation.
Well, one of the things that they provide that was really helpful in the past when, at DoorDash, one of the things that we did on Global Accessibility Awareness Day was bring content to, product people and other folks in the company that just had no awareness of accessibility and accessibility needs, especially for building product. They have a lot of great resources here and on sister sites that help you teach about some of the concepts around accessibility. And so that's part of what this organization does.
Cool. Great. Well, maybe we can move on to the next thing that is somewhat of a big transition between the two. Yeah. So the Frostapalooza is happening, which is somewhat, like, tangent to design system world. Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about it? It's happening on August 17th.
Yeah, so it's funny. Brad and I have been trading emails about this, and I owe a response. But, like, this is going to be exciting. It's a bunch of people that help build the internet every single day. all getting together, playing some music together, maybe doing some work together. I'm talking with Brad about what we're going to try to do related to design systems at the event. And so Brad's been talking a lot about global design systems, the function of that layer in between the design system you implement and HTML. And so we're going to try to take advantage of the fact that there's a whole bunch of people that really built a lot of the foundational concepts and ideas that we all use every single day. And see if we can get them talking about some cool collaborative future here.
That's cool. And play music.
Lots of music. Those are separate things. Like, I want to be clear. We're not going to be like on stage talking about components. Like, there's definitely a music portion and a maybe design system related.
I want a global design system anthem at the.
Right.
Oh God.
Well,
I'll make Adam Argyle write it. It'll be great.
Yeah, actually, maybe we should talk a little bit about this idea of Brad Frost about the global design system. Chris, did you get a chance to talk more with him about it?
Yeah, so we spent a bunch of time on the podcast and elsewhere kind of talking about the layer cake of design systems. And so if you think about the trend in the organization right now, or in like big enterprise design systems, everybody's looking at ways of structuring systems of systems approaches to the way they think about systems and design. And so, this goes way back in the stack, right? So if you think about like what's the output of a design system is fundamentally some HTML and some CSS or some Kotlin code or some Swift code or whatever it is you use for your native platform that renders in a browser or in a device. And in that process, there's what we think of as design systems, which is usually these levels of componentry that exist inside of code or exist inside of design that ultimately represent the building blocks that go and create those things that ultimately show up in screens. But going from what we consider to be a design system when we talk about design systems, and then actually getting to, like, say, that HTML and CSS, there's a lot of twists and turns that code goes through. And React renders into HTML, which then gets into a browser, and then shows up in a browser. And the way that we think about that, there's this interim layer that exists that's really challenging. And that is what represents this kind of bridge between the design system and the rendered output. And HTML doesn't have a component model that really exists inside of it. There are some things like button tags, but most of the time, what we're talking about is taking a bunch of stuff that we consider componentry inside of our design systems and figuring out how to render that out in the same way every single time. And so what Brad's advocating for is this idea that between a company that like where Allison works at Adobe, between Spectrum and HTML and CSS, there should be this global set of componentry that we all think about as being common between lots of different companies' design systems. So Adobe and Google and Microsoft and IBM would all use this same common core of a global design system. And that would be like your very basic things, unbranded, unthemed, like not design tokeny, but like a date picker is Brad's favorite one. Quantity pickers, steppers, pagination, all these things that represent those very, very basic elements would exist in some unified way that would represent a standard for how we think about the creation of these basic component elements. And there's a lot of back and forth here because there's a part of us in this world that are very deep in systems. They're like, HTML should do this. And there's another type of person that is like, there is no way in the world that my company is going to use the same thing that my competitor uses as a low-level system to be able to represent componentry. But there is definitely a problem space here that is really important. And right now, what's kind of filling that gap are things that are like Carbon, which is what IBM created, or Material UI, or Ant, or any of these other sort of lower level design system creations that ultimately are still purpose built for a company, not built to solve this global collective problem. And there is something that needs to be done about this. And I think that there's lots of different opinions on where this goes. And I think that that's like worth a moment of discussion. And Allison, in particular, I'd really like your take on this, because you help run a really giant, big, important design system.
Yeah. Not
Yeah.
to mention React Aria.
Yeah.
Right.
we can talk about it later.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Because React Aria is kind of what we're talking about in terms of like, it's an underlayer. It is shared. It's open source. There's tons and tons of imports and forks and stars and everything, you know, on GitHub. Like, people do use React Aria as the foundation for their own design systems. But the thing that, you know, I think Bragg calls out is like, well, that's React, though. It's not, you know, it's not actually a web standard. It's a particular framework that you kind of have to choose and lock into, and not everybody is going to do that. I think I have a couple of thoughts on this. The first one is, I think global, you know, standards are, first of all, they should exist. And I think they're especially interesting as we start thinking about, you know, ML and AI, and low code and no code implementation patterns and tools. Because, you know, being able to, I was talking with one of my old coworkers the other day about this, is like, I don't know where any of the ML and AI stuff is going. No one does. But one of the things that you can imagine is that the need for specific applications to do specific sorts of activities could go away at a point in the future. And all you really are caring about is, do I have the capability to do the thing that I want to do? And if I'm just, you know, typing into a prompt, you know, hey, like, start a document for me. Well, I might not need to have, you know, Microsoft Word or Pages or certainly anything native running, right? Like, it could all run through whatever parser, whatever like chat system you're using, and that could render the capability for you. But in order to do stuff like that, and in order for it to like properly compose itself and then like surface the right tools at the right time, you would actually need a UI system that is very modularized and like very flexible to be able to render all of that stuff at any given point. So I think it's kind of, you know, it's like, it's an interesting area to kind of push towards. And then I have the other like side of that coin, which is like, defining W3C standards is an extremely long and extremely arduous process. And I think it ultimately might lose the race with AI. You know, and Chris, you and I had a brief chat about this. And I think like, you know, you had this point of like, well, AI now you can say like, hey, give me a button, make sure it does these things, make sure it's accessible and doesn't have a big performance footprint and all that stuff. And like, it can basically do that for you. And it might not be perfect, but for a lot of people, that's going to be good enough. Mm-hmm. I'm skeptical in the short term that we're going to break the habit of like custom building stuff. I especially think that's true for companies of scale and for companies that have a bunch of legacy in them, like the place I work right now. I think there's just too many edge cases. There's too many like weird little requirements. There's too many stacks that you would have to integrate with. And I don't see it being possible to do that well and in a performant way, even with, you know, the most bulletproof kind of standard.
So I'm totally failing my mindfulness exercise right now of like trying to just listen and not wait to speak, but I'm so excited to talk about this.
Yeah.
Yes, 1,000 times yes. I think that the really interesting part about this is like, I heard the term about a year ago, the first time ever, just-in-time UI, right? And so the idea of I want to take an action that I need to do as a user, as like a user story or as an idea of a problem that I'm trying to solve. And I want to have the UI be highly custom to me and available instantaneously based on whatever action I want. And the idea of like that having to be some sort of low level componentry standard makes a ton of sense to be able to support something like that. I think that like that's a long way off. And it's because of a whole lot of reasons, but not least of which is like you're messing with runtime. And the moment you start messing with runtime, like things get crazy. And so one of the things to think about that is like a much more practical take on it is what you were talking about, where it's like, okay, so if you're a big company like Adobe, your brand has value. And that value of your brand in your all's case is in the billions of dollars. Like I imagine that there's probably some balance sheet somewhere that some CFO type person maintains that has like some asset for brand equity that is like really big, like really, really big, maybe bigger than the collective amount of money spent on design systems on the planet. Yeah. And so when you think about that and you think about like how people protect and curate and nurture that asset, it's still with the ability to create a highly crafted, highly customized experience. And when you think about like what an organization like the W3C would create for a standard for something like that, and like, look, the W3C is great, but the idea of like the creation of that standard, like I start looking for like a bottle of cyanide somewhere. And when you think about like the structural idea of it, I think that what Brad is trying to say is like, let's create an open source project that works on this. And that basically says like, what are the things that we can all agree on at a very basic level? And knowing that you aren't going to be able to please everyone, but then allowing people to build that highly crafted, highly customizable thing on top of it. And then probably using AI to generate a bunch of it because of like what you said, Allison, you know, give me a React button that is fairly performant and has all the accessibility considerations built into it. It's not going to be perfect, but it's likely to be good enough as a starting point.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's like, it's an interesting idea, right? Is like, can LLMs already do this for us? Could we say, instead of like generate a button, generate a basic 25 component design system that has all a bunch of low level componentry that is all accessible and all performant? Enter. Like, does that work? I don't know. I haven't tried it. I might actually do that after this chat.
I think it's interesting that the state of the art today from companies that I've worked with and talked to that are doing this sort of generative UI stuff is that a lot of it is figuring out what is the level of abstraction for like this global design system that they use to then build like a more specific and branded like design system on top, with the LLM kind of adding that top layer. So for how companies are using this today is that like they're still highly crafting the very like technical foundation of the design system in a way that still leaves another layer of abstraction that the LLM can just kind of theme and build for like a particular use case or company. And I think we're going to be at that stage for a while until the people using these LLM generative UI tools can actually like trust to use the output day to day from like something that's completely created by the LLM. But I don't necessarily think we're there yet, but probably will be soon.
Yeah.
So question for you, Chris, and obviously everybody can join in, but like when I hear you say, yeah, like the global design system needs to be like some kind of open source project, I'm thinking about the, like the working group for design tokens. So is that something that should be like its twin, or, like what are, I don't know, like what is the best structure to get, like something like that going?
I think there's a difference between the idea of trying to think about things as a set of standards and trying to think about things as like a really useful tool or a really useful project. And I think that like, regardless of what side of the debate you're on, the way that the design tokens working group decided to go was to say like, we want to create a standard. And I personally think that was the right choice, but there's some debate there, especially given like what ultimately ends up being a major difference in the implementation of tokens in Figma versus the implementation of tokens in code. The structural understanding of like what a global design system is I would want it to be a really useful project that would usurp the need for forking Carbon or something like that, right? And not to say that Carbon is bad. Carbon is wonderful. It's this incredible system, and it should be like a lot of the inspiration for stuff like this. And in fact, there's a website that's out there that I'm struggling to remember the name of right now, that is a collection of a bunch of open source components that are all sort of created in a big library. And it's something like that, but definitely not like owned by a company or owned for a purpose other than serving the needs of the broader community. So like we've thought about building this at Knapsack, for example, right? Like what if we created a bunch of generic UI that worked as components in a bunch of different languages, and that served as the starter kit for whenever you were a new customer on Knapsack, you could spin it up. But the problem is like that's innately self-interested for us, right? Like now we're creating like some generic design system that largely works just for big enterprises and largely is focused on the kind of customer that we acquire. The problem with Carbon isn't Carbon, it's that it's built for IBM. The problem with Spectrum isn't Spectrum, it's that it's built for Adobe. The idea of like, what is this thing that we could have that represents this bigger collective that is cross-framework, cross-platform, and is there intentionally to serve the needs as like a starter set of low-level componentry that we can all build from, that then gets adopted by Carbon, gets adopted by Spectrum, gets adopted by Knapsack. That's a better future, is I think what everybody's going for. And that is like admittedly on the line of a web standard, but it's one of those things that like you would I think want to go about it a very different way, where you're not trying to make something that works necessarily universally, but you're also trying not to make it purpose-built.
What about this?
Yeah, this
I
is
think it's
a
a great
link I
start.
dropped in the chat. Yeah, it's basically the W3C working group that is looking to see how do you create new HTML native elements, things like the select that we have, to extend to more of the sort of design system and complex design system components that we would want in a global design system. So there's some work here, but it is interesting to see how this idea from like Brad Frost is also coming up in a similar way to like a existing working group that I think still has a lot of progress to make.
Yeah, and that's my point with saying it's like it's a great start. I like this work is awesome. It's also it takes time, and it's also one of those things that like none of these people are getting paid for it or really at a point where they're like, hey, we're going to deliver this on like XYZ timeline, or here's the way that like maintainership of this is structured for the long haul. Like there's a ton of great stuff here. But coming from like a world of big open source projects, this is a starting point, but it's not the end state.
I confess I'm like, I'm feeling more and more skeptical the more we talk about it. And here's the reason why. My experience in design systems, it goes all the way back to 2013-ish, like working for Yelp. That was like, Yelp is like really a web product, and it's really a content like consuming kind of product, at least for the people like you and me that tend to visit it. They've got a huge ad business and yada yada yada, but that's not where I was focused. Like the things that design system needed are so different from the things that Zendesk Garden, which I worked on for almost 7 years, needed. And what Zendesk Garden needed is so different from what Adobe needs. And the just like sheer breadth of all of those different needs and all of those different consumer types and all of those different tech stacks and backends that you have to be able to hook into and all that stuff. I am like, I am not bullish on us being able to get to a place where we can fix that stuff, or that we can meaningfully address it in this like kind of open way. And I mean, Chris, maybe that goes back to your, brand value, kind of statement, which I think is true. But I don't know. I feel like these sorts of like attempts at global solutions end up being really useful for like, WordPress sites, of which there are over 1 billion, and Shopify stores, of which there are millions, right? Like these things that kind of use these like standardized CMSs and platforms that are all hooking back into the same piece of technology. And at that point, shouldn't, and they do, right? Like WordPress has its way of building and Shopify has its way of building, and that takes up 60% of the internet. I don't know at this point, like some large percentage. That's probably not 60%. That's probably overstating it, but
no, I mean, like at least at one point it was.
Yeah.
And I think that you make a good point here, right? Like this always goes back. There's always this really interesting dichotomy, right? Of you ask 5 people in the room where they want to go to lunch, and nobody is going to be able to agree. But you get 500 people to show up in a major city for a conference, and all of a sudden it's a packed house. Yeah. And so the challenges innately in like organizing humans can't be ignored when you're thinking about systems like this. But I think that like when I was a part of the Drupal community, one of the fascinating things about Drupal, right, is like people had personal Drupal sites, but then also Drupal powered like the White House. And so it was one of those situations where if you looked at that from like the big to small, you could see the commonalities. And a large part of that was like the design around frameworks. But then there was this separate design track that was like the design around the product itself. And the product itself as Drupal was never, in my opinion, like the thing that was the driver of major adoption. It was the idea that like this was a framework for how you'd manage content that worked really, really well at a very large scale and at a very small scale. And I think that that's what a global design system potentially provides us is like, yes, an imperfect solution, but pretty much everybody has a button, and it'd be nice to all agree on what a button is. Pretty much everybody has a drop down. It'd be nice to agree on that, a text field, a label. And I think that that's what we would want to drive at, right? Like, I think that there is this idea of like a graph visualization, like a line chart, right? That's gonna be pretty hard to have a baseline idea of what a line chart is, because that probably would mean 4 different things to the 4 of us here. But when we think about like the 20 or so really foundational pieces of interfaces and experiences, I do feel like there's hope, I guess, for like a button, a modal, a drop down, a form input, and I don't know, a tooltip or something like that, right? Maybe
don't you feel like we already have that though? Like not to totally steer us separately here, but like I feel like Wyaria does a lot of that, right? Like there are standards for these things. We do know what they should and shouldn't behave like. And similarly, like HTML gets us pretty far too. So I guess, and I'll play my own devil's advocate here, right? Like part of the problem is that for every person that looks at Wyaria, there's, a new interpretation of Wyaria. But then again, like, even though you might interpret it and be like, well, it's fine, it works. Like, I think this conforms to Wyaria. Like, if you hire a team to audit your site for compliance with accessibility standards, and they evaluate it and they're like, no, that's not true. Like that, you didn't get it right. Like that kind of is the gate. So I don't know. I feel like we're in this place of like, we might not have everything that we need, but I think we probably have 80% of what we need already there. And I don't know that extra 20% is worth it. I don't know.
Yeah, but so agreed, right? Like I think that you're on the right track. I think that what's different is the distribution, right? Like where's the Git repo that you say, let me import this package from global-design-system as an npm package that goes into my build process that includes those foundational components. And like that's what people are doing right now with lots of different design systems. And the idea of like the upstream problem there is really painful. Like when Google releases an update to material, there's a whole lot of pain that happens in our industry for like the next couple of months after that. And that's because the idea of like, how does that open source design system that serves a whole bunch of people get adopted and updated? And I think that like, if we were thinking about this from a global design system perspective, you would want to have something that was publishable that people could just adopt. And I agree that like a lot of these decisions are made. I just don't know if they've been codified in a way that is easy to distribute. I don't know. I think this is the debate, right? Like, I'm not 100% sold on this myself. I'm definitely playing the like, hey, I'm the guy that wants this, but at the same time, I don't know. Maybe this isn't the right thing. I think that there's a healthy conversation that still needs to be had here.
Yeah.
Yep. Agreed. Cool. Well, I think we can rest this topic there for now because I don't believe we're going to solve it this morning, unfortunately. Yeah, I was maybe switching gear a little bit, but Allison, I'm very curious to hear your most recent story because, as you mentioned, you are now, and I think you started like 4 or 5 months ago at Adobe. Yeah. You were before at Zendesk, and not throwing any shade at Zendesk because I think it's an awesome design system, but it's definitely a different scale. Yes. So how did it go so far?
I'm definitely still in my onboarding phase. I plan to wear that like the new kid hat for at least another 6 months, as long as people will let me. But yeah, I mean, Zendesk was around like between 5,000 and 6,000 people, about 1,000 people between design and engineering, for most of the time that I was there. And Adobe is an order of magnitude larger in every way that it can be, like total number of employees, the size of the engineering and design organizations. The design organization is maybe more than an order of magnitude bigger. So it's just a lot. And Zendesk was, it's really one web product that has a bunch of different apps that are kind of like tied together loosely. But Adobe is literally hundreds of products across every type of platform, things that, go from, your mobile phone to AR and VR and all of the like design tooling that you need in between, video, like 3D, the whole thing. And actually so much of Adobe's business, this was something that I was aware of, but like didn't really understand the scale of it. Like Adobe has the Creative Cloud, and I think in the design community, obviously that's what they're known for. But Adobe also has a ton of marketing properties with the Experience Cloud. And we also have a bunch of like document capabilities. Like we've got, a legal signing product, and we've got Adobe Acrobat, which I think has some ridiculous number of like monthly actives. Adobe, like PDFs are still the best way of just like making sure that someone can open your document regardless of where they are. And that technology continues to help power the Adobe business as well. So the types of things that Spectrum has to work on and has to be able to meaningfully address is shockingly large.
I mean, it's like, is that intimidating? Like, it sounds like it would be. If
Yeah.
I were in your position, I'd be like,
100%.
Yes.
I'm not touching anything.
like, how do you change to a system like that? Like, how would you change a text field, which I assume is in like every product?
Yeah. Luckily, I'm not the one who has to make those decisions. That's what my team does. And they've been there for longer. So
Good to be the boss.
yeah. I just have to make sure that people know what's about to happen. No, and in seriousness, like, Chris, you kind of showed the Spectrum 2 like promo site that we put out in December, and this was a wholesale rethinking of the visual language of Adobe. Spectrum was Spectrum 1, we call it now, was very utilitarian. It was really meant to help people understand what they needed to do in an interface at any given point, but it ended up feeling, as things do, right? Like 5-6 years down the line, it starts to feel a little out of touch. It starts to feel a little old. Visual styles change. But I think more importantly, the ways that customers want to interact with their software and the way that they want their software to feel has changed. And Spectrum was very buttoned up and kind of like dense. And Spectrum 2 is really, you can see all of these little teasers that we put up, but it really is much more about sharing the experience of creation with other people. It's really about opening up that interface, making the interface a little bit more expressive, making things bigger so that it's actually easier to use, brightening up the contrast on things. Like one of the easy examples that we give of how did it change for real is, we've gone from having 4 different color themes, lighter, light, dark, darker, to actually just having 2, and making sure that those are both, contrasty enough so that people know what they need to do and can otherwise kind of pull back. So those are things that the team actually came to through a huge amount of collaboration. Chris, I think you talked to Sean, who's the senior director of my organization, and I think he mentioned, we brought together over 100 people from across the design organization to jam on this stuff and to, understand where they were seeing troubles, understand where they were having a lot of success, and working to create something together that we are pretty sure is going to work across our entire portfolio.
Well, this is actually remarkable, right? I want to talk about this, like the home run that it is. When you think about, we talked about the scale of all the different products you all have in documents, in marketing, in all sorts of other spaces. But the home run here is that it was more than just let's go talk to a bunch of people. It was let's re-architect the way we think about this as a company. And for one of the biggest design companies on the planet to basically say, we're going to completely shift our organizational structure to be more systems focused, to be more cross-functional, to unify a bunch of these people under this same idea that Spectrum is the future of the way that we build product. That's not a trivial thing. That is a gigantic change to one of the world's biggest software companies.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I mean, to be fair, we're really kind of, I think it's a home run, but we're still we haven't even reached first base yet, we're still running the bases on this one. We're still getting it built and implemented. We're still working really closely with the first customers to make sure that it actually is working. We're dealing with a bunch of, different teams that actually have to implement this, right? Spectrum is many different implementations of the same visual language. So we've got the desktop web, But even with that, there's two different implementations, right? There's the web components implementation, which actually sits within the Spectrum organization at Adobe. But then there's the React implementation, and the React implementation actually sits in a different organization from Spectrum. They're part of a different cloud, and that's where we have that basis for React ARIA. But then on top of that, React Spectrum is built, and we have to work with their team, their implementation team, and they're fantastic. We love working with them. And then we work with our own implementation team. And sometimes we have to work to resolve like differences of opinion and like how something should be implemented or how something should work, what the boundary of the component or the pattern is. And that can be, that takes time, that takes effort. And that's not even to talk about, desktop applications, the mobile applications, the difference between, iPad and iOS and all of those. Like, it is a little bit mind-boggling. I've taken the approach of like, I'm just going to do one thing at a time. Like, let's ship web stuff first, because we know that that's where most of Adobe's opportunity is, right? And that's where we have the most opportunity to help teams adopt quickly and easily. And more, next generation products are being built directly for the web. But, once that's done, we're on its way. It's never going to be done. But once that's on its way, then we'll turn our attention to the other, next highest priority stuff. And then I'll be mobile and desktop.
Cool.
Yeah. But yes, it's mind boggling. And
do you have
sure, I'm going to break something at some point.
What was maybe like, for now anyway, maybe what was like the most surprising thing that you learned since you joined? Or, like things that, like you mentioned a little bit about marketing, but I don't know, is there like just, it can be like tiny, can be huge, but like something you were like, oh, I never thought about it.
I knew that we had I knew that we had that marketing business. I actually really did not understand how big it was. It is a huge part of the company's like balance sheet. And they're doing some really cool things right now. They're actually at the forefront of trying to, think about how do we combine a bunch of different capabilities into, a single new application. And that's really cool. And that's actually, I think, a place where design systems can be really, really supportive. And also it can be one of the biggest challenges, trying to integrate with a bunch of different areas of the product. But I think like in general, right, I think design systems teams tend to be like small and mighty. And even though the Spectrum organization is fairly large, it is still a small and mighty team compared to the rest of the organization. And it can be challenging for folks to like reckon with that. And that's one of the things that I think, continues to kind of like come up in surprising ways.
Like, what are some of those ways? I'm really curious about this, right? Because the Spectrum team is small, but you're supporting thousands of designers, maybe tens of thousands of engineers. Like, how does that impact really scale across an organization like Adobe? Because I can't imagine there's even 100 people actually working on Spectrum, but it impacts so much.
Yeah,
the ratio is crazy.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
I mean, I think our ratio is actually fairly standard-ish. I think we're probably like between 1 to 10 and 1 to 15. Those numbers might be fake. I'm trying to think because I know how big our overall organization is, but we also have a prototyping arm that's inside of our org that supports the rest of the organization, but is not actually like Spectrum. So it might actually be worse than that. But in any event, I mean, One of the things that I think is actually tough, right, is actually being able to get out into the rest of the design organization and really understand the ways that people are using it. I think we have a challenge in offering the right level of support to the rest of the teams, and being able to scale that support. Lucky for Adobe, I come from a customer service company, so I have a couple of ideas. But I think that is one of the hard things. And I think we're also, I think we also deal with the same challenges that any organization does, which is that there are varying levels of maturity around what it means to design with a systems first approach. And that's something that, we're certainly going to be tackling. And we have a lot of support from the top to tackle that problem as well.
That's fascinating because it's like I'm firmly in the camp infrastructure of where design systems live, but this is kind of like that product conversation, right? Yeah. Like, how do you support thousands of users? And a part of the idea of something like Spectrum is that it does have this like outsized impact, that it is supporting all these other people at like whatever ratio. And like, honestly, the ratio conversation is a little weird, but the same time trying to say, how do you have as big an impact as possible in this organization with as few people as necessary building it? Like, I think that like when we talk about the scale of impact of design systems, we think about it as like anyone building product inside of one of our customers or inside of one of the companies that Knapsack serves should use the design system as a part of that process of building that product. Yeah. And even if that's like just a couple of touches in a week, it usually is more than that. But even if that's what that is, there's value in every one of those interactions. And when we talk about like scaling the value, that's what we usually have that conversation around.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a lot. I think, that's one of those things, right, where like we've been so focused on design and, initial build phases for Spectrum 2 that some of the things that we do need to do to help kind of like scale that support, like documentation, and it has taken a backseat. And we've been intentional about that. And we've been clear about that. But it's also something that we are going to have to tackle because we do need to be able to give people a place to go and try and self-serve first. And right now they kind of have to piece things together, and that's difficult for them. But, Spectrum 2 is still in beta right now. So people shouldn't be trying to build entirely new products off of it just yet. But, that's something that we know we're going to have to invest in. And that's something that we're going to have to put people's time on in the coming months.
Cool. Well, we can wait.
I guess one thing I was curious about, because you mentioned there's different levels of maturity inside of the company in terms of how system oriented they think, and when they look to Spectrum to build their products. I'm curious, like coming from a company that was smaller, what is the sort of mindset shift that you've taken, or like the tactics that are different that you think about when trying to have a cultural change in terms of how to think about design systems? Is there a big gap in how you thought about it before, or are there similar threads?
I think it's pretty similar. I think I think one of the reasons why they hired me is that I'm extremely pragmatic about what success looks like and what progress looks like. And, I'm not someone who's going to say that like, oh, well, like you designed with Spectrum, but you differed from our implementation and that's bad. And so you shouldn't have done that. I'm going to say like, that's amazing. Like you tried to design with Spectrum. There was a little bit of a misunderstanding around like what the code does versus what you saw in Figma, but like, it's awesome that you did that to start with, right? And now we get to work together to try and make some progress here towards something that's even more standardized versus, like just having the look, but not the feel. But I'm, Zendesk, when I started, was very immature with design systems, and the design system was in a place that it really wasn't very trusted and it wasn't really relied on. And over time, over that period of 7 years, like, we built that design system not just into a very strong like piece of software, but we created a real sense of like shared ownership with the rest of the company, with the rest of the design organization and the engineering organization. And we built trust with them. And we did that in like the oldest school way possible, which is like, we would talk with people and we would get up and, we would communicate authentically in every type of situation, right? Like, one-to-many with Slack, one-to-many with meetings, one-to-some with like office hours, one-on-one in cases where that was necessary. And like over time, people start to understand and they also start to trust. And Spectrum is starting from a great place of trust within the Adobe organization, right? Like, people are excited to use it. They come to Adobe. They know that Spectrum is something that they're going to be able to leverage in their work. And also there are all those differences that we talked about. But, I'm going to do the same thing at Adobe at a different scale as what I did at Zendesk. But it's that same approach of like, put together the resources to help people who've never really designed with a system before to understand what it means to be a systems first designer. Work with engineering to make sure that they feel like they're getting what they need from those components. Work with product to help them understand the efficiency gains and how much faster time to value they're going to get if they make sure that their teams are using Spectrum properly. Work with the executive team to make sure that there are the right incentives in place at the business level. And all of those things over time add up to, a more successful design system overall.
That's really
Great
cool.
story.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Allison. So we're almost at time, and I thought maybe we would end on a lighter note, but I'm just curious. Obviously, Adobe's been around for a while, and I'm guessing that at the very beginning, like your career or your education, you probably used Adobe product like I did, and I'm pretty sure like 95% of the people in our industry did. How do you feel about the fact that now you're working on Photoshop, something like that?
Yeah. I love it. The thing that I kind of said in my interview, right, is like, I'm a tool maker. That's how I see the work that I do. And to be in a position to be a tool maker for the tool makers is like, it's an honor. And I feel like really lucky to be in that position. And I'm just looking forward to finding all of the ways in which I can, help these products be the best that they can be and be the most inclusive that they can be. And I get to work with really awesome and smart folks all the time. So it's going to be good.
Great. Thank you very much, Allison, for your time today.
I love the passion too. That was awesome.
Yeah.
That was great.
Cannot wait for seeing what Spectrum's future is bringing. So please let us know, and maybe we'll invite you back when you have something to show us. But it's been a pleasure, Allison, as usual. And yeah, thank you very much. And
thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Bye, everybody. Have a good one. And until next.
Bye, all.
Bye.